Garth Nelson. Isn't that a great name? Garth Nelson. That's the name of the person who changed the world for me. Garth was a counselor at the summer camp that I attended as a boy. He was my tent counselor the summer I was 12, but more importantly, he was the trip counselor for the camp. So he organized and led all of the trips in the White Mountains that I took. Garth was a god to me. He could build a roaring fire in the middle of a pouring rainstorm. He could find his way home from the middle of a forest with some kind of weird sixth sense. He didn't need a compass. He could lift a fully loaded backpack on one shoulder and pick up a kid who had sprained his ankle on the other shoulder and make his way down Mount Washington. I was there when he did that. Garth Nelson. Garth changed my world by showing me things I'd never seen or perhaps never noticed. On our hikes in those mountains in New Hampshire, he put me in touch with nature in new ways. At night, he'd show us the stars and name the constellations for us. And as we hiked, he would point out where an animal had bedded down for the previous night. He'd describe how the lichen clung to the rocks on an exposed ridgeline and how they survived even in the harsh New England winters. He made us feel comfortable in the outdoors. He made us feel safe. And he taught me to love nature rather than to fear it. Now, I'm not saying that I'm a boy who changed the world like those in our story today. I haven't created a new crop that will end world hunger or anything like that. But if you trace the story back that we heard this morning, you trace it back and back and back, you see that there's this cumulative effect, and adding on and adding on. You have Norman, the man who figured out the high-yield crops that fed 2 billion people. You have Henry Wallace, who taught him. He was his teacher and mentor. Then you have George, who just took Henry as a young boy out for walks in the woods and taught him how to be curious. And before that, you had Moses, who rescued George from the outlaws. And we know that there was someone behind Moses who taught him that life is valuable and you need to do what you can to save it. And there was someone behind that person and behind that and behind that person. So this, you know about this. You know about links in a chain. You know about the butterfly effect. It's called the butterfly effect. And what the butterfly effect says is that small differences in a system can lead to big differences down the road. And this is a scientific theory. It's been shown to be real. It got its name more than 50 years ago when a scientist by the name of Dr. Edwin Lawrence delivered a paper about climate change and about weather systems. The title of the paper was, "Does the flap of a butterfly's wing in Brazil set off a tornado in Texas?" And he showed through computer models and other demonstrations that in fact, what happens at the beginning of a process can make a big difference in where that process ends up. And so in our story today, we have to wonder whether Norman would have figured out how to feed 2 billion people had it not been for what Henry did before him, and George before Henry, and Moses before George. This weekend, we celebrate the birthday of the great civil rights leader, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Dr. King is certainly a man who changed the world. There is no doubt about that. He showed us a new way of being together. He preached a gospel of equality and love, a gospel of peace, peaceful resistance. He taught us to stand on the side of love, to treat each other with dignity and respect, and to fight injustice where we find it. His words and millions, generations around the world, and I'm sure he will for a long time to come. Sometimes we can get caught up in our worship of this great man. We want to be like him. We want to do something or say something that's lasting, that will have an impact. We'd love to do great things, to be remembered for something that we've done or said, to leave a legacy, maybe even change the course of history. And at the same time, we realize that the chances of that are probably pretty slim. Maybe one of those children we dedicated today, those 5 children, will grow up to be another visionary leader like Dr. King. And I pray that that's true, because there's no doubt that our planet needs more people who were like him. But the odds are that all of us will likely live a more ordinary life. But don't let that discourage you. That's the point of our story today, because you never know. You never know how what you are, who you're with, how what you do might be a link in a long chain that eventually will lead to someone who will change the world. Remember this. Dr. King didn't just descend from heaven and start marching in Selma and giving speeches on the Mall in Washington. He had someone who taught him that all people should be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And that person who taught Dr. King this had someone else who influenced them. Maybe someone who showed them that it's the right thing to do, to speak up when you see a wrong. And that person, of course, was taught by someone else, maybe taught about the wrongs of slavery, and back and back and back. Reverend Carol Taylor mentioned Peter Rabel, and he has a writing that we often quote here: "We drink from wells we did not dig." And it's that same idea that we are all butterflies. We are all butterflies. And everything we do, everything we say, every day matters. We don't know how. We don't know when. It might not seem to make a difference in the moment, today or tomorrow or next week, and we may never even know the impact that we have. I had the privilege of finding Garth Nelson about 15 years ago and thanking him for the impact he had on my life. And he had no idea. And it felt good to be able to acknowledge that. But how many of us have been influenced, as we've heard today, by others who don't have a clue? And so how many of us have influenced others and we don't have a clue, and we don't know where that's going to lead and where that's going to end up? Moses had no idea that by rescuing George, he was going to help feed 2 billion people. Not a clue. But he did. He did. Garth Nelson learned his love of nature and the outdoors from someone, and he passed it on to me. I've tried to pass it on to others, and someday, perhaps someday someone down the line is going to become a scientist who discovers how to end global warming and save the planet. Who knows? It might just be one of those kids that we had in our service today. We are all butterflies. May we remember that each and every day. This day and every day, I wish you peace. Amen.